Welcome. From compliance headaches to team culture to scaling smart, Retail Revelations is about what really makes or breaks cannabis retail. We dive into the real truths about what can help or hinder license holders. I'm Chelsea Mulligan, the Dispensary Whisperer. With over 80 dispensaries open, managed, or triaged, and over 120 licenses touched nationwide, I specialize in transforming chaos into compliance and building teams that genuinely want to come to work. I've worked with everyone from regulators and FDA inspectors to legacy operators and court-appointed receivers. My roots are in the operations and compliance, and I've had the honor of supporting teams, state regulators, and even internal policymakers in creating systems that work. I thrive in helping operators build businesses that are not just compliant, but human-centered and profitable. Shout out to Beard Bros Media for always supporting that work and being the voice of grounded, transparent cannabis news. Today, we are diving into a subject that I very much enjoy, with a human I very much enjoy, and we get to talk about a topic that most operators absolutely need to understand, and so do brands: receivership. What is it? How do businesses end up there? What do you do when it happens? Joining me is Ryan Baker, a seasoned fiduciary who has managed over 200 cases across multiple industries. Ryan, can you start by just sharing a bit of your journey as a receiver?
Absolutely. And first of all, just thanks for inviting me, Chelsea. Happy to be here. And my story, like most receivers, I didn't grow up thinking I want to be a receiver when I grow up. I think most people don't even know what a receiver is until it's too late. But I kind of fell into this during the great financial crisis. My mentor, Bob Mosier, he back in the day was appointed over a $1 billion Ponzi scheme by the Securities and Exchange Commission. And it was an all hands on deck. And he asked me to help wrangle sort of this massive global case. And for those who aren't aware, a receiver could be appointed in the case of fraud if there's a securities fraud. And so a receiver will parachute in and take control and try and make a recovery for all of the Ponzi scheme victims. And so this one, for years, I was traveling around the world, recovering assets and working to make victims whole. And this kind of became my proving ground. And I just kind of really loved the work where I get to wear the white hat and try and help out folks and right some wrongs. And it was a mix of finance, which I really enjoy, investigations, problem solving, and just enough courtroom drama to kind of keep things interesting. So, and then since then, I've handled around 200 plus receivership cases across every asset class that you can think of: real estate, operating companies, schools, hotels, golf courses, and yes, even cannabis. And so for cannabis, around 2019, we could really start to see that the cannabis was booming. And by probably early 2020s, the wave of receiverships began. And since then, I've been appointed roughly about 50 cannabis licenses that range from dispensaries, delivery services, cultivation, and even once a consumption lounge.
So for those who haven't heard that term before, what exactly is a receivership, and how does it differ from bankruptcy or a restructuring process?
Yeah, great question. I've never been confused for a wide receiver for a football team. I have been confused for a receiver of goods. People call me up and say, "Hey, can you receive 5,000 shares?" And I'm like, "You got the wrong person." But you can think of a receiver kind of like a referee or a paramedic. When a business is in chaos, whether it's from a loan default or fraud or the partners are just at war, the court kind of will parachute in a neutral professional to stabilize the situation, preserve the value, keep things fair for everybody involved. And so that's kind of the way I kind of equate it to a corporate custodian. But if you want to do more of the dictionary definition, receiver is just really a neutral fiduciary that the court appoints. The receiver is kind of an arm of the court to step in and take control of a troubled business or property for one reason or another. And our job really is just to preserve value, manage the assets, guide them through the conflict or financial distress, protect the interests of all the stakeholders. That includes the lenders, the owners, the tenants, landlords, the like along the way. So that's kind of what a receiver is.
That was a super digestible way to explain it. So thank you. What circumstances typically land a cannabis business or any retail business in a receivership? Is it always financial, or can compliance, partnership disputes, or mismanagement handle it? Trigger
Yeah,
it.
so there really are what I would say three big drivers for this. The biggest of them all is a loan default. Lenders, not just in the cannabis industry, but across all asset classes, lenders often turn to receivership instead of foreclosing on it to protect their collateral. So if a borrower defaults on a loan and the lender is saying, wait a second, what's happening to my collateral? Is it being protected, or is it not being cared for correctly? Let's put in a third party neutral to take care for it and make sure that it's preserved, at least so that it survives. The second one is fraud or misconduct. I mentioned the SEC case earlier, where the SEC alleged that some fraud or misconduct was happening. And so sometimes we're kind of brought in to stop the bleeding and investigate if someone's saying that another person's doing something illegal. And then the last one is kind of partnership disputes. And in cannabis, this is huge. I've seen businesses crippled because partners are fighting so badly that no decisions can be made. And Chelsea, you and I actually worked together on one of those. It was a dispensary where the partners were at war. They couldn't agree on anything. It was just creating chaos for the employees. And so bringing in a receiver kind of allowed us to stabilize the business, keep operations going until the dispute was resolved. And thankfully, they did resolve the dispute, and we were able to kind of fold up the tent, and they were taking it on from then.
Yes. Very fast-paced work, very interesting work, and rewarding, usually.
Sometimes, yeah, I like the rewarding part. Sometimes they can just be they can be a little crazy.
Yes, I'll agree with that statement. Once you're appointed, what are the first things you look at in a cannabis retail business? What does what I like to call triage look like?
Yeah, and triage is such a great word for this, and so important. Many times by the time I'm appointed, the issues have just metastasized, and there can be so many fires going on that it's not a question of being able to solve everything, but what do you solve first? How do you put out these fires and stabilize this thing? And so the first thing that I always look at is cash. You got to secure the cash. We contact the banks. We freeze the accounts, bring those funds into an account that only I control. The next one is inventory. We make sure that we check metric for any suspicious inventory movements and confirm that there's hasn't been any recent movements. And again, you and I worked on a project where 3 days before my appointment, they decided to ship off 75% of the inventory off to some other dispensary that they owned. Fortunately, we were able to get the judge to tell them to turn it back. So those are the two main things. And then I just kind of work my way down the list. Compliance status. Are we in compliance with the DCC and all regulations? Do we have security? Are we secure at night? During the day, do we have enough guards? Do we have cameras? Insurance, do we have that in place? So making sure that the basics are covered so we don't lose value anywhere overnight is kind of the phase two, I'll call it. And then after that, it's budget. What's our AR? What's our payables? Is there any way to chip away at those critical vendors and make sure that they continue to supply so that we can keep the operations going? Make sure that we have enough money for payroll. So that all is critical to making sure that these businesses are able to operate. And an operating business is also so important to keep it moving. You don't want to shut these down for a multitude of reasons. I mean, first and foremost, you're going to have employees who you're going to have to terminate. And that is one of my worst parts of my job, is that oftentimes happens. I'm called in too late. And there's just no way to turn this around and save the jobs. And then second, you just want to make sure that you maintain the value. And an operating business just has so much more value than liquidating the business in piecemeal. So timing matters. If we're appointed too late, sometimes we're just liquidating what's left. But when we get in there early enough, there's time to stabilize and fight for the business. And one example that I can kind of think of for that is there was this cultivation in Desert Hot Springs, and this business was just a really high-end cultivator. they had raised $70 million and developed these 3 cultivation sites. And at my appointment, it was a matter of utmost triage. We secured the cash, we did a budget, and we determined that we had 6 weeks of cash available before we had to just shut everything down. And so we had to throw together a sale process. We obtained a buyer. We were able to recover some value for our creditors, but we were able to really establish a structure where we got this new buyer to step into the operations under a management services agreement, and they would get all the benefits of operating. If they make profit, wonderful, they get to keep it all, but also they had to deal with any new obligations going forward, payroll, vendors, taxes, anything going forward would be their obligation. So we were able to transfer all the employees over to them so that they can keep things running, save about 100 jobs that they had out there, while all of the pre-receiver debt that was accrued prior to the sale, they didn't have to deal with that. They weren't burdened by that baggage. So that was a good success, but that's just kind of an example of what you have to deal with and the timing pressure that you have oftentimes in these situations.
I think one of my favorite things about working alongside you in these projects is how human-centered you are. Sometimes that's not always the focus, and I appreciate that even when we do have to make the hard decisions and let people go. Just example in your answer, the first thought was employees. They now don't have jobs, and you and I've had a couple of those conversations around the holidays, and they're uncomfortable. And but working with somebody that understands that is appreciated. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, we're all human first in this, So
yes. How does being a receiver in the cannabis space differ from other industries you've worked in, given the regulatory complexities, cash-heavy operations, and licensing requirements?
In so many ways, cannabis is probably one of the hardest businesses to run. Just coming from all angles, just the cash requirements, the regulation, and the competition. Also the landscape of the industry, the acuteness and the distress right now in the cannabis world is astounding. If you are currently surviving in the cannabis business, that means you have tons of battle scars and are still standing. My hats are off to you, because it has been difficult to run. This has gone on longer than anybody has really anticipated. The second thing is you've got regulation. The regulatory compliance in cannabis might be harder than any other business I've ever run. And I've run hospitality, I've run restaurants, I've run nightclubs, and it's just the amount of regulation and the cost of the compliance to be under regulatory compliance is staggering. And then lastly is I think a tough issue is the competition. Yes, there's competition from your fellow business operators, people who are operating down the street and doing the same thing you're doing. But you also have this significant competition coming in from the illegal market. And it's so hard to compete when so much of your competition doesn't have to abide by the rules, doesn't have to adhere to the regulation, doesn't have to pay taxes or other difficulties. So that's the difference here from any other business that I've run.
Okay. If you're a cannabis operator facing financial strain, what are the warning signs that you may be headed into a receivership? What proactive steps can you take if you are a cannabis operator?
Sure.
To avoid
so yeah, you might be heading to receivership if you have a partnership dispute. I think you'll probably notice that if you're not communicating with your partner, or one of you has locked the other out, that's usually a sign that a receivership might be coming down the road to level the playing field, make sure that there's transparency in the operating business. Some might think that cash strain is a sign. Cash strain is pretty common in the industry, so that alone doesn't mean you're doomed. I think the red flag for most people that they'll be able to see coming is when your lender is calling you every day and you're not answering the call and you can't pay them. And I would just say that radio silence makes lenders assume the worst and pushes them to court action. If you're in trouble, I can only recommend to communicate. Be transparent with your lender. I think everybody is very familiar with the distress, and so it's no one's going to be surprised at what's going on. Just show them, hey, this is what I'm doing. This is how it's going. It's rough. This is what we're thinking of. Be transparent. You can also look for outside capital. It's tough, but not impossible. There are some still out there, although the well is drying up. I think the well's been come back to 2 or 3 times, and everybody's hoping for this regulatory change. And every time there's talking about, changing the schedule of it, everybody gets excited again. And then the last thing is I would just show a plan. Even a small, realistic turnaround plan can buy you time. But if you are simply waiting for regulatory change, I candidly don't believe that's coming anytime soon. If you asked me 2 or 3 years ago, I'd say, oh, yep, it's coming around the corner. Honestly, now I don't think anything's happening in 5 years and anything significant where it's going to, federal legalization. I don't think that's happening for maybe 10 years.
I will agree with you. And I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful we either stay the same or deschedule. And I don't see descheduling coming anytime soon.
Yeah. I hope I'm wrong. I could be wrong. I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball, but I haven't seen any signs that point me to something different.
Agreed. So that was 4 people before they're in receivership. Once they're in receivership, what is a way out for a cannabis business of the receivership? Can they recover and regain control? Or is it typically just a path toward liquidation? I know you talked about timing, but outside of that.
Sure. Yeah, receivership isn't always the death sentence that people think it is. The goal is to stabilize the business and maximize the value, which sometimes means keeping it alive, sometimes means selling it, sometimes means winding it down. So there are 3 primary exits to receivership. 2 of them do involve liquidation, but the first is refinancing or an investor buyout. Sometimes the existing owners can find new capital and refinance the debt. If they can demonstrate that, there's a plan here that can keep the business viable and pay off creditors, they can petition the court to terminate the receivership and take control back. I actually have one case right now. It's a $105 million loan over a mixed use property. It's got multifamily and commercial retail component to it. And candidly, given the financial kind of industry, the factors in the economy right now, I just didn't think that there was an appetite for refinancing a $105 million loan. But the borrower is making a really good run for it, and they may be able to pull it off. And I'm very impressed. I'm kind of rooting for them. I want, and the lender is rooting for them too. If the borrower refinances, they get paid off, and everybody's happy. So that can be a really good outcome for everybody. The next 2 are sales or liquidations. There's the going concern sale that I talked to you, and this is very common in cannabis. If we can keep the business open, compliant, and we can market it as a going concern and find a buyer and transfer licenses, that's a huge win. The buyer will step in, bring in their own little capital, stabilize the operations, and rather than a distressed fire sale, which kind of means employees keep their jobs, customers keep shopping, and creditors get a better recovery, frankly, because the last option would be an orderly wind down or liquidation. If there's no cash, you can't keep the business operating. There's no buyer interest. Then we have to do an orderly shutdown, sell the inventory, pay for what we can, close the doors, and usually that's the worst outcome. Usually there's not much money in that. I think everybody probably knows that selling some lights or reverse osmosis machines or what have you, there's not much value in a lot of the equipment, but it's better than just a chaotic collapse. It's better to just try and do an orderly wind down and do it in a thoughtful process. But kind of thinking about what's kind of really important to understand is that time is your most valuable asset in a receivership. The sooner we're appointed, the more options that we have. If I walk into a dispensary with 1 payroll, left and unpaid taxes piling up. My job is very different from walking in where I've got 6 weeks of cash, which is not optimum, but still enough to do something, where I can market the business and try and get a buyer lined up.
Thank you. That was a super candid answer. And I think it's important for people to understand that it isn't the end of the world, right? There are options if they look for them and apply them properly. Because of the federal illegality, traditional financing and restructuring, just, those aren't really options in our industry as much. So how does that impact the way you oversee a cannabis business when you're appointed?
Sure. Yeah. So, that's one of the toughest parts about cannabis. In most industries, if companies in distress, bankruptcy court can be kind of a reset button. You file a Chapter 11 and you come to court and you say, hey, yes, I've tried to run this and we've run into some issues, but I've got a plan. We just need to reorganize our debts and we can come out of this alive. In cannabis, that button doesn't exist because of the federal illegality. A bankruptcy court is a federal institution, and under the federal regulations, cannabis is illegal. So this is not a viable option. I think, it's funny. There's a couple of courts right now that are trying to figure out if there's some way to allow cannabis businesses into bankruptcy court. There was, and it's I don't have it offhand. There is one case where a judge said, hey, this company isn't operating anymore. It used to be cannabis, but it's a year removed from all this. And so bankruptcy is allowed to touch this. But in a majority of ways, bankruptcy has ultimately dismissed a lot of these and says this is not a viable forum for you. So that said, receivership can kind of become a functional substitute for bankruptcy. And we do this not just in cannabis, but in other ways as well. But it allows us to transfer licenses in a compliant way, preserve operations so a buyer can step in seamlessly and have kind of an organized process, and also protect lenders without triggering years of litigation. In some ways, it forces creativity. Bankruptcy is highly regulated, and there are certain rules that have to be abided by. Now, there are rules in receivership, but we have more flexibility that in what kind of options we have. So receivership, we use a management services agreement, which I think most people are familiar with, MSAs, to kind of bridge gaps during a sale, because we negotiate with regulators to ensure that the license doesn't lapse. We allow the buyer to step in while we're trying to transfer the licenses. So that's kind of a way that receiverships can help. And, in a way, the limitation in a weird way kind of creates also an opportunity. Buyers know that if they step into a receivership, they're oftentimes getting a clean slate that they wouldn't get in a messy direct acquisition. I was just talking to some folks the other day, and they said, we really are. They're a very large cultivator, and they want to do some transactions and do some mergers and acquisitions, but they're very concerned about some of these legacy baggage by these operators. They owe a lot of money to vendors, and they want to buy and keep these businesses going, which have a lot of value to the economy overall, to jobs, whatnot. But they don't want to step into those shoes of that operator and take on all that baggage. It's just too heavy. It's going to bring the company down. So there are ways in receivership to kind of cleanse these assets. One other thing I've just mentioned is also assignment for the benefit creditors. That's another option that can be used to help sort of cleanse some of the historical baggage that has been accrued on a business. And that's what bankruptcy does, but we don't have that option. So now we're starting to use these other options to do that. And I should have mentioned too, an ABC is a statute. It's usually a state statute that allows you to go through a bankruptcy-like process and try and cleanse some of those assets. And that's why these are reasonable tools to try and utilize in cannabis.
Before I wrap up and ask you a question about your work in the future, is there anything else you would like to share about receiverships in cannabis, or about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm most proud. We were talking about this earlier. I'm most proud of cases where we've been able to kind of keep people employed and maintain a community resource. Cannabis businesses, they're not just pot shops. They're part of an ecosystem, and so we can preserve jobs, keep compliant product available, and be able to hand these over to responsible operators. That's a big win. And for the future, I'm hopeful. I think there's been a lot of headwinds. Like I said, if you are still surviving in the cannabis industry, my hat's off to you. You have survived a lot, and I see operators, getting smarter. There's an industry professionalization. The systems are getting stronger. I have a colleague who I work with, and the way he calls it is that the industry has gone from backpacks to briefcases. Compliance and financial discipline are becoming the norm, not the exception. People used to carry cash around in backpacks, and now there's kind of a level of corporate sophistication that's absolutely necessary for the industry to grow into in order to become the professional industry that it needs to be. That's kind of what I'm proud of, and kind of what I see in the future. I hope I'm wrong, because on federal reform, I think that it will be sometime, but if it came through, it would be huge. I think we can get mini wins in the middle, in the midst of that, though. Safe banking, rescheduling would do a lot of benefit, but federal recognition is the game changer. That needs to happen in the industry. Bring in institutional capital, more sophisticated restructuring tools so we can have bankruptcy again. So I don't know. Bottom line, I think the survivors of this current shakeout will be stronger, more compliant, better positioned. There are people who are thriving. So I think that they will figure out a way to push forward. And that's good for everyone, employees, regulators, consumers, for all of us.
I agree. Where can our listeners find you?
Yeah. Easiest way to connect, probably LinkedIn. Just search my name, Ryan Baker, or my business, Verax Business Group. And that's where you'll find about our work. Or you can visit our website, Verax Inc. That's VERAXINC.com. And if anybody's curious, Verax is just kind of it's Latin for speaking the truth or integrity. So that's where that comes from.
Well, I very much appreciate you being here with me today and breaking down a subject that is elusive, confusing, and you made it easily digestible. So thank you very much. Receivership may sound like a worst case scenario, but it's really about stabilization, transparency, and sometimes even giving businesses a second chance. So thank you so much for everybody listening today. I'm Chelsea Mulligan, the Dispensary Whisperer. You can find me on LinkedIn as Chelsea Mulligan, Instagram as the Dispensary Whisperer, or at chelseamulligan.com. Please make sure you go connect with Ryan on LinkedIn and follow Verax Business Group's continued leadership in the fiduciary world, as I'm sure we will see a lot more of him in cannabis as we go forward over the next few years. Make sure you follow Beard Bros on Instagram. And if you're in California, Missouri, or Massachusetts, find their amazing RSO Dablicator and tincture products at a dispensary near you. We all wish we could sesh with the bros in person on the daily, but unfortunately that isn't a reality. Shout out to those that were recently at the Friday Sesh Live. Your next best option is to sign up for their Friday Sesh newsletter at beardbrosfarms.com. Thank you for listening and have a great day.